Hey YouTube, it's Matt with Olympus Reptiles, and we are going to continue our series about what can, upend the ball python or dethrone the ball python. And on this video, because this is a snake that we're going to talk about, I've never personally bred, but Caleb has, so we're going to end up turning the reins over to him to talk more about this one and whether or not it can unseat the ball python. He has some very strong opinions about this species. Strong. That may be upsetting to some. Maybe you agree with him. I don't know. So what I'm going to do, because I'll be honest, I'm tired today. I'm going to go have a seat, and I'm going to let Caleb handle the very first part of this. I might share a few of my thoughts at the end, but I'm going to turn this over to Caleb and let him just do his thing.
All right, so the species we picked today is corn snakes. It is something I have bred. It's something I've kept for a while. It's actually one of the first non-venomous snake I worked with at the zoo was a corn snake. His name, I don't even actually remember now. But it was an albino. It was really pretty and I liked him. So there's a lot of criteria we talk about when we think what can unseat a ball python. Size, how well it is at being handled, which kind of ties into size, the entry-level price and the upper end price. We talk about how easy they are to care for, and we kind of talk about just the different variety of morphs. And then availability is also a super important one. If you're in Australia and you were watching this, sorry, I'm almost 99.99% sure you don't have those over there. But you might. There's going to be some places that can't. So that plays a role. Here in the U.S., strictly speaking, they're pretty available. Mostly because you can find them in probably 30 of the 50 states. That plays a role. Now you might say, well, Caleb, there's no corn snakes in the wild. They're just called rat snakes. There's a billion different common names and things like that, but they're all in the same little family. So as far as morphs go, there is a good amount of corn snake morphs. In fact, before ball pythons, corn snakes were the ball pythons of the reptile hobby before ball pythons unseated them. Problem is, most of them are recessive. I can think of 3, and there may be more, but I can think of 3 that are incomplete dominant. The rest are mostly recessive. That makes it a little bit trickier to get into, just because, again, you need 2 copies. So you're going to need at least 1 copy on mom, 1 copy on dad, as opposed to having something that you just need 1 copy of. So that in that case, now you're having to buy 2 specific snakes for 1 project, right? The other thing, though, is size. And size-wise, these guys get not super big. I think the biggest one I've ever seen was probably almost 6 foot, not quite there, which is a good size. That's what you want it. It's big enough to be really exciting, but not so big that it is unmanageable like a retic. The problem is they have a little bit of a frail feeling to them. They feel like they're not as thick as a ball python or a blood python or a boa, which we've talked about. And they're pretty squirmy. So you feel like you can hurt them. You feel like you don't have good control over them. And as they get older, they do mellow out quite a bit and it gets a little easier. But those babies, man, and that's when he said strong feelings. I'm not a huge fan of corn snakes. They were fun. I thought babies were a pain in the butt. They just were. They were squirming everywhere always. They were just a pain. They're so tiny you had to get day-old pinky mice just to feed them, and even then that was still felt like really big. Maybe I just hatched tiny corn snakes. I don't know. And then circling back to morphs, entry cost and that upper limit. While I did say it was kind of hard to get into projects because they're mostly recessives, corn snakes have been around long enough that recessives are super cheap. I remember buying a snow corn snake probably 3 or 4 years ago for $50, as opposed to a ball python snow is probably $300 to $400. Don't quote me on that. I'm not in the snow project. I'm sure there's going to be someone already typing that comment in saying, screw this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, the prices are wrong. You're probably right. But comparatively, ball pythons are way more expensive morph-wise when you talk about combinations and gene stacking than corn snakes. It's just how it is. So it's still pretty easy to get into those projects just because, again, I just named off a double recessive, anery, albino, corn snake for $50. That's pretty easy entry. And there is still an upper limit. I think the last time I looked was like palmettos were probably the most expensive morph, and they were, several thousand. Now we're not talking like 50,000 like some ball pythons are going for that. So their growth or their highest point is still marketably smaller than ball pythons. So that I kind of, I don't know if that's a hindrance or not. It's easy to get into projects, but what is the profitability? Now they do lay more eggs. I don't know what the actual average is, but I think my females averaged about 15 eggs. So I don't know if it's higher or lower or whatever. So you do get more babies per clutch, so that helps with your profits. But in the grand scheme of things, when you can hatch ball pythons for a couple thousand, and even more on that higher end scale, corn snakes can't compete at all. Then we talk about care wise, they're pretty easy. Again, especially if you're native to the US, they're native to here, so just keeping their temps fine is pretty easy. It's not something I really worried about, winter temps or nighttime temps. I didn't keep mine in racks. Sorry, fighting a cold. I had PVC cages or glass aquariums for babies, and I would have heat lamps on them instead of heat pads, and I'd turn that off at night. Even if my house got down to 50 degrees, I did not worry. Now, if we're talking consistent, prolonged 20-degree temps, if your house is that cold, you have more problems to worry about. But then I would put some supplemental heat. But if it's 50s, I really don't worry. They're native to around here. In the summertime alone, it gets in the 50s at night pretty easily. And by the time it gets winter, they're starting to burrow, which is where it starts getting hairy, right? Because, while yes, they can probably withstand some cooler temperatures, but you got to think they're burrowing really not even that deep. If you go 2 feet deep, you're still going to have a pretty medium warm ground. I can't remember what it was, but there was a study when I was working with sulcata tortoises. It was like every 6 inches was warming like 3 or 4 degrees. So when you're talking 2 feet, you're getting a pretty stable temperature. So care is super easy. I think these guys could have had the potential if ball pythons came first to unseat the ball pythons. But having ball pythons unseat them, not really having, which is kind of, this one actually blows my mind. We get new ball python morphs all the time. They're not even native here. The amount of new corn snake morphs is few and far between. And I'm not in that hobby, so I don't keep up to date, but really there hasn't been anything that I would consider a game-changing morph in a really long time. So that also kind of dilutes that project, makes it a little bit harder to unseat something when you have something that comes out with something new. I feel like every year, right? It would be a fair statement, every year. So it's going to be tough. They could do it. I think they would probably be the closest thing to be able to do it, but I just don't think it gets it done at all.
So, I actually agree with a lot of what you said. I didn't know if I would. And to me, that this is also, of all the species we've talked about, which as of this point, we've covered carpets, which I love. Mm-hmm. We've covered bloods, which I like. We've covered western diamondbacks, which will never... But I love them. They're my favorite. I also agree that, the corn is not my passion at all. It's just not my style of snake. That, if anything we've talked about were to unseat the ball python, it would be, and we've talked about hognose, forgot about them, can't leave the hognose people out, it would be the corn snake. Again, the legality issues, they're legal almost everywhere. They're easy to get a hold of, they're easy to handle, the size is appropriate. Like, it's all there. It's really all there.
Yeah.
But if they were supposed to be there still, then the ball python likely wouldn't have unseated them, right? Yeah. That is the problem. So, I'll get that later. Sorry, I'm buzzing on the camera here. But could they, if ball pythons were to continue to crash, could that market overtake? Yeah, it could. If there's one market that could do it, it's the corns.
Yeah.
I don't see it. If I had to put odds on it, like if I was putting odds on everything, I would say the bloods have less than a 5% chance. I would say the rattlesnakes have a negative percentage chance. I would say the hognose probably 15%, 10% chance. And I'd say the corns, the carpets, probably 5%. I think it's worse than the bloods even for overtaking. And I'd say the corns have maybe a 25% chance of pushing it out. Best odds of anything so far. I'm just pulling that out of my ass, so don't hold me to it. But it's just because they've been there. They've shown that stability. And the fact that even when they got unseated, there's still a pretty strong market for corns. There's still people who are just, man, they're colubrid people. And not only about the eggs, you talk about you get about 15 out of them, but you can double clutch these things too, right? So you can get 2 sets a year. You shouldn't probably do it all the time, but you can.
It's possible. I'm sure I've seen it. I never did it, and I never really read about it, so I can't really speak on anything on that.
I'm going by memory, so if I'm wrong, corn people, feel free to tell me I'm wrong. But I do think that you can double clutch a corn and get 2 sets of eggs in a year out of it on occasion. Maybe not all the time, but I do think there's less exciting numbers and more. But there are also more locality issues. In the ball python market, we probably did a really piss poor job as hobbyists early on. Wasn't me. I wasn't in there at that time. About not keeping the locality stuff separate. You know, about the only locality you ever really hear of is Volta. Thank you. And
people still mess that up.
People still mess up. They think it's a gene.
They think it's a gene. Yeah.
It's not. It's a locality, and you know they tend to be just bigger,
yeah.
and then they tend to have not bigger eggs, more eggs.
Yeah.
So, you know, but there's different localities with
yeah.
python too. So that's where I'm at. I agree with you. Like I thought you were going to say there's no way corns could do it, and I was going to be like, oh man, I think corns could.
Yeah. No. I mean, no. Much as I'm not a huge fan of babies. I don't hate corns. I liked them as adults. I think they're really pretty. There's even a few morphs I'd love to have. But at the end of the day, I just don't really care for babies. And that's another thing that for me is like, if you want something to take over a market, you have to be able to have a large scale, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a bunch of babies that are a pain in the ass to work, that is also going to hinder it. Because I don't want to spend 120 hours dealing with babies that, you know, trying to find the smallest pinky to feed them, or
buddy.
You know, they're shooting out of the rack if people use racks. You know, I really don't know what people are breeding them in nowadays. If people are using rack or even aquariums, you know, they're just rocket launching out and they're squirming, and I just don't.
Now, corns do not have, for the most part, the feed issues that ball pythons can have. One thing that keeps getting brought up in a lot of the comments is, you know, ball pythons have all these feed issues, which I think if you have a pet ball python, just like 1 or 2, you don't typically have feed issues if your care is on point. You have this kind of room, you're going to have a little bit more.
You know, and one thing I would love to be able to do is have the money to do independent studies and things like that. I don't have the money or the schooling background to do that.
Me neither.
But if you know, I always think about it like this. Ball pythons, snakes in general, right, do not eat a same size meal every week.
What?
On the date. Sometimes people feed them more often, which is crazy.
Be very careful. One time I said there was no scales in Africa, and had a guy get really mad at me and tell me about how developed the African continent is, and I was also like, all I meant was there's no snake crawling on a scale saying, wait a minute, is it okay for me to breed?
Yeah.
You're saying the wild snakes aren't treated like captive snakes?
No. And so
son of a bitch.
Sometimes I wonder if in the wild it's feast and famine. I know that for a fact because that's how it is across every animal, reptile,
Reptiles is built for
mammal, amphibian, whatever, right? Any living being that isn't humans has a feast and famine. Some more so than others.
Yep.
But I'm going to guess that snakes eat a ton during their wet season or whatever, warm season, depending on whatever continent they come from, right? And then during that dry season when things get really rough or cold, they eat less, maybe not even at all.
So we had a battery issue. The issue was it ran out of power. So we switched batteries. We're good now. But we're going to have a little bit of a hard cut here. So Kurt's going to try to make it like magic, and you probably won't even notice it. You won't even notice it was there because that guy is that good. So we're just going to run right back in and talk about how they feed.
So, you know, if you feed an animal every week the same size, 52 weeks in a year, for 40 years or however long it lives, it's going to have more weight and more, and again, depending on how you care for it, probably less muscle to fat or more fat to muscle ratio than it would in the wild. It's going to have more excess to burn off. So I think a picky eater, or what people call picky eaters, are going to struggle, are going to be more common in captivity than they would in the wild because you're not having, and I know a couple people, and again, they only have 1 or 2 ball pythons. They have many other snake species, but 1 or 2 ball pythons, and so their sample size is really small.
Yeah, before we get too deep on this, this is actually a great topic that probably deserves its own video.
Yes, probably.
Yeah, because there's some studies I read a long time ago referencing some boa constrictors talking about this exact same thing too.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we just focus on, don't get too deep in the woods because you're going to ruin 2 topics together. Just stick to the damn colubrids.
I think snakes are fed too much. I'll leave it at that.
Snakes are fed too much. You know who else was fed too much for a while?
Me.
There's less of me now than there was. There's less of you too.
There is.
There went less of you and more of you, but now there's less of you again. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You know who doesn't have less of
Although
you?
I say that, I drank a 2-liter pop and ate a whole large pizza last night for dinner.
You know who doesn't have less of him? Kurt. Because Kurt's never needed to get less, and that motherfucker stays thin all the time. We all hate Kurt around here. And with that, we're going to jump over to Patreon, and we're just going to talk about why we hate Kurt. We will see you all next time.